It was the kind of winter that seemed to close in around you, swallowing light, sound, and time itself. The kind of winter where the mountains of Wales crouched heavy under a sky the color of cold ash, and every breath you took left a ghost that lingered just long enough to remind you how alone you were. In 1978, the village of Cwmmerth, tucked between those iron-gray hills and the ribboning River Deaf, was already fading into the kind of obscurity that makes it invisible on most maps, a place where families counted their lineage by the cold dust in their father skin and the knitting calluses in their mother's hands. And yet it was here, in this pinprick of a place, that two small girls had become the center of a story so strange, so quietly devastating, that it still refuses to loosen its grip on the memories of those who lived it. I first saw them in early January, when the frost had turned the hedgerows into cages of ice, and they were walking hand in hand along the narrow lane that led from the post office to the railway bridge, identical in their knitted red hats, identical in their slow, deliberate steps. And even from a distance, there was something about the way they moved, measured, mirroring each other exactly, that made you watch them longer than you meant to. In a village where every face was a familiar one, theirs were somehow both known and unknowable, as if you'd seen them before in an old photograph but could never remember when or where. They were the Morgan twins, Eira and Seren, born just 5 minutes apart one blizzard night in March of 1971, to a mother already worn thin by 3 older children, and a father whose lungs rattled with every shift he worked in the pit. Their home sat at the edge of the village, a slate-roofed terrace that trembled when the cold trains passed. And the girls spent most of their early years within the cramped kitchen or in the back garden where the grass never quite grew right because of the ash that settled from the chimneys. At first there was nothing remarkable about them, 2 pale, quiet children among many. But as they grew, people began to notice the silences, how they rarely spoke to anyone outside their family, how they turned their faces away when spoken to, how their eyes would flick toward each other, quick as a bird's wing, before one would answer in a voice so soft it was almost swallowed by the wind. And then there was the other thing, the thing that turned them from shy oddities into something altogether more unsettling. They spoke to each other in a language no one else could understand, a liquid, musical string of sound that had no place in Welsh or English or anything that had passed through this valley in living memory. I remember the first time I heard it, on a day when the snow had been falling for hours and the air smelled of iron and wet wool, the 2 of them standing under the dripping eaves of the chapel, heads bowed together, their words spilling, fast and low, a strange, lilting rhythm that made you think of running water over stones. They didn't see me watching, and even if they had, I doubt they would have stopped. Their worlds seemed to begin and end with each other, the rest of us existing only as blurred shapes at the edges. The teachers at Cwmmerth Primary didn't know what to do with them, and in those days there was little patience for anything that didn't fit neatly into the order of the classroom. So notes went home about failure to integrate and communication difficulties, though privately more than one teacher admitted to me that it wasn't a lack of communication, it was a choice, deliberate and absolute, to speak only to each other in their strange, self-made tongue. Their parents, especially their mother, Bronwyn, insisted it was just a phase, some twin thing that would fade as they got older, but you could see the worry etched in her face when she thought no one was looking, the way she'd press her lips tight when the girls ignored a neighbor's greeting, or how she lingered outside the school gates longer than the other mothers, her arms folded tightly across her chest, as if holding something inside her that might break. I wasn't yet the person who would spend years chasing answers to their story. But even then, something about them lodged under my skin, a thorn I couldn't stop touching. In Cwmmerth, nothing stayed secret for long. Rumors about the girls ranged from harmless to cruel. That they were slow, that they were cursed, that they'd inherited something wrong from a great aunt who'd been sent to a sanatorium in the 1920s. Children could be merciless, and though the twins endured the snickers and imitations in silence, the cruelty left its mark in the way they began to walk closer together, shoulders touching, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if the rest of the world had nothing for them but cold wind. It was the winter of '78 when I started keeping notes about them, though I didn't know why at the time. Scraps of overheard conversations, small details I thought I'd forget otherwise, like the way Eira always touched her left wrist before crossing the street, or how Seren would blink rapidly 3 times before answering a question, as if signaling something only her sister could understand. And perhaps it's worth saying here that in Cwmmerth, The winters had a way of making the days blur together, of convincing you that life had always been like this. Gray sky pressed, low, cold grit on your teeth, the smell of damp stone in your clothes. But looking back, I can see that those months were the slow tightening of a rope, drawing the twins further and further into themselves while the rest of us stood watching, unsure whether to reach out or step back. The days leading to what would come were marked by small, almost imperceptible shifts. The girls began skipping school more often, always together, always vanishing without a word, and returning hours later with their hair damp as if they'd been near the river. Neighbors reported hearing them talking late into the night through their bedroom window, the strange language rising and falling in waves, sometimes sharp like argument, sometimes soft like lullabies, and there was something else too, something I couldn't name then, but feel even now in the marrow of me, an undercurrent of inevitability, as if they were walking toward some fixed point none of us could see, bound together by threads stronger than anything we could understand. I didn't know then that the notes I scribbled in the margins of old receipts would one day become the spine of a story people still ask me about, a story that begins in that frozen winter, when two little girls in red hats walked hand in hand down a narrow Welsh lane, speaking a language no one taught them, and ends in a way that still makes me wonder whether we ever really knew them at all. The schoolyard at Cwmmerth Primary was a small, uneven rectangle of tarmac, bordered by a low stone wall and the skeletal arms of an ash tree that never seemed to grow leaves, no matter the season. And in the years that I tried to reconstruct the events that led to the disappearance of Eira and Seren Morgan, it is that yard I keep returning to in my mind, a place where the air always seemed colder than the rest of the village, and the wind carried voices in such a way that you could never quite tell who was speaking. The twins, for all their peculiarities, were never outright excluded from the daily rhythm of school life, but they existed in a sort of quiet orbit, never colliding with the other children, yet never straying so far as to draw real suspicion. It was in that liminal space, half inside, half outside, that their strangeness began to crystallize into something everyone noticed. In the mornings, when the whistle blew and children poured out from the cloakroom with half-buttoned coats and still damp hair, the Morgan girls would stand side by side against the far wall, hands clasped in front of them, their gazes fixed on the gravel just beyond, the tarmac, as though they could see something that the rest of the U.S. couldn't. When approached by a classmate, a rare event, they would either turn their heads slightly toward each other and begin murmuring in that flowing, otherworldly language, or they'll respond with the bare minimum in Welsh or English, their words flat like stone skimmed across still water. The teachers tried to integrate them, seating them in different groups, pairing them with more talkative children, but each attempt ended the same way. One twin staring out the window, the other scribbling strange shapes in the margins of her exercise book, the shared silence between them growing thicker until even the teacher's voice seemed to fade beneath it. I remember one particularly bitter morning in February when the frost clung to the chain-link fence like lace, and a boy named Daffod dared another boy to snatch Ira's hat. It happened quickly. One moment she was standing still. The next the red wool was in Daffod's hands and he was running across the yard, laughing. What happened next has stayed with me more vividly than most things from that year. Seren didn't shout or cry, didn't chase him. Instead, she turned to her sister, and in a voice that was sharp and rapid, she unleashed a torrent of their strange language, her eyes locked on Ira's as if they were alone in the world. Whatever Seren said, it had an effect I still can't explain. Ira's face didn't change, but Daffod, halfway to the other side of the yard, suddenly stumbled, as though the ground had given way beneath him, the hat slipping from his hand. He picked it up, muttered something I couldn't hear, and walked back to Ira without meeting her eyes, placing the hat gently back on her head before walking away. No one could explain it, least of all Daffod, who claimed later he had simply lost his footing, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that told me it wasn't the whole truth. Incidents like that only deepened. The air of mystery around the twins and children, being what they are, began to invent their own explanations, that they could cast spells, that they were witches, that if you listened to them speak long enough you'd start to hear your own name buried somewhere in their words. For the adults, the explanations were less fantastical but no less uneasy. Some said the girls had learned the language from an old book, others that it was a secret code to keep the world out, a symptom of something not quite right in their minds. Bronwyn Morgan, fiercely protective of her daughters, bristled at the suggestions. But even she could not deny that the girls seemed more withdrawn with each passing week. The headmaster eventually called in an educational psychologist from Cardiff, a man with round spectacles and a notebook always at the ready, who spent 3 days observing them in class and on the playground. At the end of his visit, he told the staff that while the twins displayed an unusually high degree of synchronization in their behavior, there was no evidence of cognitive delay. What they had, he said, was a private world constructed between them, impermeable to external influence. I've often wondered if he realized how ominous that sounded, or if he was simply stating it as a clinical fact. Either way, nothing changed after his visit, except that the twins seemed to draw even closer together, their shared language becoming faster, more intricate, and increasingly laced with what sounded like repetition, as though they were refining it to some final, perfect form. In the classroom, I would sometimes see them writing to each other in tiny, looping script that bore no resemblance to Welsh, English, or any alphabet I recognized. At first, I thought it might be their attempt at code, but the shapes were too fluid, too organic, as if the letters themselves had grown out of the paper. One afternoon, while waiting for the bus, I watched as Seren handed Eira a folded scrap of paper. Eira read it, smiled faintly, and then tucked it into her coat pocket without a word. I never saw what was written on it, but I would think about that scrap years later when other scraps began to surface in the most unlikely places. It was around this time that the teacher began to notice another oddity. The girls were rarely apart, but on the rare occasions they were separated, even for a few minutes, they became visibly agitated. Once, during a fire drill, Eira was let out of the building with her class through one exit, and Seren through another. I saw Seren's head whipping back and forth, scanning the crowd until she spotted her sister, at which point she broke from the line and ran to her, clinging so tightly that it took 2 adults to pry them apart for the head count. To some, it was just another example of twin closeness, but to those who paid attention, it felt like something else, something more urgent, as if their separation posed a danger neither could name. In those months, the weather began to shift towards spring, but the sense of chill around the girls never lifted. They continued to speak in their flowing, secret tongue, continued to move in that perfectly mirrored way. And though life in the village carried on, coal shifts, chapel services, market days, there was a growing sense, unspoken but palpable, that the Morgan twins were moving towards something inevitable, something no one in that schoolyard could stop. I didn't know it then, but the whispers that filled that tarmac space in early 1978 were the first cracks in the wall of normalcy, the subtle signals that a vanishing was already in motion, long before the day anyone realized they were gone. IT was in those late winter months, when the frost still lingered on the edges of the hedgerows, but the air carried the faintest promise of thaw, that I began to truly listen to the Morgan twins' language, not just as a curiosity, but as something that might hold the key to who they were, and where their story was heading. And the more I listened, the more it unsettled me. At first, I thought it was simply gibberish, the sort of playful nonsense that children sometimes invent, but the longer I paid attention, the more I began to hear patterns, repeated syllables that seemed to serve as anchors, changes in pitch and tempo that corresponded to moment of emphasis, pauses that felt deliberate rather than accidental. It wasn't just the sound of it that caught me, but the way it seemed to carry weight between them, as if entire histories and emotions were embedded in those syllables. I'd see Eira tilt her head slightly when Seren spoke a certain phrase, or Seren's eyes flicker with a knowing glint when Eira repeated a particular sound, and it made me realize they were not only conversing but reinforcing a shared memory bank, one that was closed to the rest of us. They never spoke this language in front of adults unless they were forced to, and even then, it was often reduced to a whisper so faint you could only see the movement of their lips, but in the spaces they considered safe, walking home down the lane, sitting together under the ash tree at the far end of the schoolyard, or huddled on a low stone wall behind their house. It flowed between them with a fluency that would put lifelong bilinguals to shame. I once asked their older brother, Reese, if he knew what they were saying, and he just shook his head with a mixture of frustration and resignation, telling me they'd been doing it since they were little, and that even when they were toddlers, they'd babbled to each other in ways that made no sense to anyone else. Their mother insisted it was a phase, but there was an edge in her voice when she said it, as if she feared it was something deeper, something rooted in them like the stubborn ivy that crept up the stone walls of their home. In my own quiet investigation, I tried to compare what I heard to other languages, recordings of Welsh dialects, fragment of Romani I'd once heard from a traveling family, even snatches of Breton and Cornish from old BBC programs. But nothing matched. The twins' speech had a cadence that was almost hypnotic, the words strung together like beads on a string. And if you listened long enough, you could almost believe it was more than sound, that it was a code not just for communication, but for existence itself. The teachers, by now weary of trying to force the girls into ordinary speech, began documenting their behavior more closely, noting that their strange language often coincided with moments of stress or transition, lining up for assembly, changing classrooms, or being given new instructions. It was as if the language served as a lifeline, something they could grip tightly when the outside world threatened to pull them apart. One day in March, I caught them in a rare moment. Indoors, sitting side by side in the library, a book open in front of them but untouched, their heads bent close. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. And then, softly, Sarah began to speak. The sound was almost melodic, her voice rising and falling with an odd musicality. And Eira responded not with words, but with a rhythm tapped lightly on the wooden table. 3 beats, pause, 2 beats, pause, then 3 again. They repeated this exchange several times before closing the book and leaving without a glance in my direction. And though I wrote the sequence down later, it meant nothing to me. It was moments like that which made me certain their language was more than verbal. It was a system, perhaps even a private culture, complete with its own cues, rules, and rituals. Rumors in the village took on a sharper edge, with some claiming the girls had been taught the language by someone in secret, perhaps an old relative, perhaps a stranger passing through. Others whispered that it was a remnant of something ancient, a fragment of a tongue spoken in the valleys before even Welsh took root. Bronwyn, worn thin by the gossip, began keeping the girls at home more often, which only deepened their insularity. On the rare occasions they appeared in public, walking to the corner shop or sitting together at the bus stop, they would speak to each other in quick, furtive bursts, their eyes scanning the street as if aware of how their voices pulled at the curiosity of those who heard. I remember the vicar's wife telling me, in a voice half whisper and half prayer, that she'd overheard them behind the chapel one afternoon, their conversation so rapid and intense it sounded like water boiling over a pot. When she rounded the corner to greet them, they stopped instantly, their faces blank, the language evaporating into the cold air as if it had never existed. It was around this time that I began to notice a shift, not in the language itself, which remained as fluid and indecipherable as ever, but in the way they used it. It had become sharper, faster, as though they were trying to compress more meaning into fewer moments, as though some unspoken deadline was drawing closer. I'd see them in the distance, heads bowed together, speaking so quickly it seemed impossible they were processing each other's words. And yet they never interrupted, never faltered. The rest of the village, meanwhile, began to grow uneasy in ways they didn't fully articulate. Parents telling their children not to stare. Shopkeepers pretending not to notice when the twins murmured to each other in line, as if ignoring it might make it disappear. But for me, the language had become a kind of obsession. I started carrying a small notebook everywhere, jotting down phonetic attempts at the sounds I heard, sketching symbols I glimpsed in the margins of their school books. Though each time I tried to compare them, the patterns eluded me. There was one phrase, however, that I heard often enough to recognize. It began with a soft Shah sound, followed by something like Cwmmerth, and each time it was spoken, both girls would fall silent for several seconds, looking at each other with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I still don't know what it meant, but I know it mattered to them in a way that nothing else seemed to. In hindsight, I think their language was not just a means of shutting out the world, but a way of building something only they could inhabit, a place that existed between them, untouchable, unbreachable, and entirely their own. And if that was true, then perhaps it was inevitable that one day they would step fully into that place, leaving the rest of us behind, wondering what doors their words had opened and why none of us could follow. Be why the Time Springs hesitant light began to touch the valley in 1978. The Morgan twins had built their world so completely around themselves that it was almost impossible to imagine them any other way. And to those of us who watched from the outside, it felt as though brick by invisible brick, they were sealing themselves behind walls no one else could climb. Their home at the far end of the terrace had always been modest, a narrow strip of rooms stacked one atop the other. But as the girls retreated further into their private world, it began to feel like a fortress. the curtains drawn earlier each evening, the front door opening less and less often. Even their older siblings seemed to circle around them without truly engaging, as though recognizing some silent pact they were not invited to join. Bronwyn, their mother, had stopped trying to coax them into after-school activities or Sunday school, claiming they were too tired or under the weather, and though she wore a brittle smile when neighbors asked after them, there was a hollowness in her eyes that betrayed a deeper worry. Their father, Gareth, who had always been a man of few words, seemed to shrink further into silence. His presence at home reduced to a shadow in the armchair, coughing into a handkerchief blackened by the coal mine's toll. The twins' isolation wasn't just social, it was physical. Where once they had walked through the village lanes without much notice, now they were seen only together and only along certain routes, as if mapping a territory they alone were allowed to cross. They avoided the main square, choosing instead the narrow back lanes where the cobblestones were uneven and weeds pushed through the cracks, and on the rare occasions they passed someone else, they would press close together, their bodies angling inward, eyes fixed on the ground. It was as if the rest of the world had become dangerous terrain, something to be navigated with precision and caution. Inside the school, the pattern was the same. They moved as a unit, rarely speaking to teachers, never speaking to classmates unless addressed directly, and even then offer replies so clipped they felt more like deflections and answers. What unnerved me most wasn't their silence toward others, but the way their communication with each other seemed to grow denser, more urgent, as if they were racing to say things that could not wait. In lessons, I'd catch them exchanging quick bursts of their language, barely audible, before one of them would scribble something in a notebook and slide it across the desk. The teachers had given up trying to confiscate these notes after discovering they were indecipherable strings of symbols and loops, no two ever exactly the same. Some thought the writing was random, but I'd seen too many repetitions of certain shapes to believe that. It was a system, perhaps even a written counterpart to their spoken tongue, and the more they used it, the more complete their world became. By April, rumors in the village had taken on a sharp edge, with some saying the girls were not right in the head, and others claiming their parents encouraged behavior to keep them dependent. I don't believe either was true, but it's remarkable how quickly a community can turn suspicion into something resembling certainty. I'd overhear snatches of conversation in the post office queue, half-whispered judgments about the Morgans letting their girls run wild in their own heads, and though no one confronted the family directly, the subtle withdrawal of warmth was palpable. Fewer smiles in the street, fewer invitations to call in for tea. The isolation became a feedback loop. The more the girls were kept at home, the less they knew how to interact with others, and the less they interacted, the more the village retreated from them. And yet, from inside of their invisible walls, the twins seemed utterly content, even defiant. There was no sign they longed for inclusion or felt the sting of exclusion. Instead, they leaned into their separateness, their mirrored movements more precise, their private conversations longer and faster. One afternoon, while I was walking home, I passed them sitting on the low stone wall near the railway embankment. They didn't see me, and I slowed my pace just enough to listen. Eira was speaking in a steady stream of their language, her voice low but intense. And Seren was nodding, eyes locked on her sister's face, as if drinking in every word. At one point, Seren reached out and took Eira's hand, and in that moment they fell silent, their gaze holding as though something had been agreed upon without needing to be said aloud. There was an intimacy to it that was both tender and unnerving, the kind of moment that makes you realize you're intruding on something sacred. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice them spending more time near the railway bridge at the edge of the village, a place children were usually warned to avoid because of the trains that rattled through at unpredictable times. They would stand there for long stretches, leaning over the rail to watch the water far below, speaking in quiet bursts before lapsing into long silences. I couldn't help but think of their world as a room with no doors, a place where they were safe from the noise and demands of everyone else, but also a place that seemed to be narrowing around them, the walls drawing closer with each passing day. Sometimes I wondered whether those walls were meant to keep others out, or to keep the twins in, and if they were building them higher because they knew, in some way I couldn't yet grasp, that they were preparing for something that would require complete separation from the rest of us. It was a thought I would return often in the months ahead, especially when I replayed the image of them on that stone wall, hand in hand, gazing toward the bridge as if it were not a boundary but a threshold. Here is Section 5, a shadow over the bridge written as a single uninterrupted paragraph of no less than 2,000 words, delivering the first major twist while keeping everything grounded, human, and emotionally razor-edged. In the soft collapse of a Welsh dusk, when the last light doesn't so much fade as slide, reluctantly, into the seams of the valley, the bridge at the edge of Cwmmerth looked like a thought held between two dark hills, the iron latticework black against a sky rinsed in as old milk. On that evening, the evening villagers still argue about over shopping baskets and pint glasses. The twins were there again, hand in hand, red hats of ghosts of color bleeding through the dim, their steps precise on a narrow footpath that rattled when a freight moaned across. I know they were there because half a dozen people saw them. Megan from the post office, cycling. Home, the Davies boy lingering with a packet of chips gone cold. The railwayman's wife cutting across the field with a bag of prayers she'd never learned how to unpack. And even me, a poor witness weighed down by my own certainty, watching from the path above the allotments where I'd stopped to tie my boot and instead found myself frozen, feeling that familiar prickle along the scalp that comes when you know a small moment is about to become a hinge. Eira and Seren didn't speak as they approached the midpoint of the span, or maybe they did and the river swallowed it. But then something happened, something so ordinary and so seismic at once, that later we would replay it frame by frame. A cold train shrieked its arrival somewhere in the near distance, a long, unbroken sound that turned the air into a taut wire, and as it headlamps slid along the track like the eyes of a patient animal, the twins stopped, not in fright, but as if arriving at a mark chalked on the world for them. Alone, they turned toward each other, and though the noise swelled, I heard it, just a slip of sound woven between the iron and water. Seren said Cwmmerth. The phrase I'd written a dozen times in the dog-eared notebook I kept for them, and Eira nodded with the solemnity of someone closing a door. The train tore onto the bridge, and everything rattled, bolts, ribs, nerves, and for a breath-holding minute, all we could see was a battered procession of open wagons and covered vans and the tremor of the footpath under the twins' boots. Even from my distance, I could tell they were steady, palms pressed together, identical profiles turned slightly inward as if the other's face were a compass. The river frothed and glowed with stray sparks, and then, at last, the tail lamp went winking away toward the yard Pont Lecred, and the world unclenched. The bridge stilled, the air exhaled, and they were gone, not like a conjurer's trick, but like a page torn quietly from a book you meant to keep. Megan would later swear she'd never taken her eyes off them, that the blink of metal and noise had swallowed the last of their red hats, and the Davies boy said he was sure he'd seen a hand. He could never say whose. Rest for an instant on the rail, and the railwayman's wife insisted that she'd heard a single sharp syllable, "Sha!" cut off mid-breath, like a match blown out. People ran then from corners and kitchens, the way people do when the air shifts and you feel the story calling, and by the time I reached the bridge, panting, my throat burning with the metal of it, 3 men from the pub were already peering over the side, shouting down to shapes with torches scrabbling along the bank, and someone had run for Gareth, and someone else for Bronwyn, and the evening, which had begun as a simple piece of time, became a container for panic. I found myself moving without thinking, feet taking the planks in quick stutters, eyes on the scuffed marks left where the twins' boots had been, and there, barely visible in the new dark, I saw a chalk mark against the inner rail, a small, almost dainty curl, white like the beginning of a letter that never got written. I ran my thumb over it, and it came away powdery, recent, and something cold moved into the center of me. Behind me, Bronwyn's voice broke the air, hoarse, raw, calling both names in a tone that didn't so much ask for an answer as beg the world to rewind, and Garrett's steps were the sound of a man walking into a future he'd hoped to avoid. Neighbors clustered with their own versions of help, ropes borrowed from sheds, a blanket no one would need yet, a flask of tea that would go untouched. The police were rung, but in those first minutes, before uniforms and procedures, we were just a village, that old, unwieldy organism that wakes when one of its parts is struck, and we did what we could. Men dropped to the embankments, women fanned out along both approaches, boys with fast legs pelted the footpath on the far side, and I, useless notebook in my pocket, kept looking for something I couldn't name. The river has a way of keeping its own, counsel, but that night it spoke with cruel clarity. No scuff in the mud where 2 small bodies might have slid, no torn or snagged on bramble. No point of entry or exit in the reads. Nothing. The police arrived with the careful, restrained urgency of people who've been trained not to mirror the world's panic. And though they told us to step back, they also took what we offered. A line of torches moving in orchestrated arcs. A methodical sweep along both banks. Calls and names sent out with. The rhythm of a metronome. I stayed on the bridge, eyes flicking between the chalk curl and the plank scuffs. The marks of presence, the evidence of absence, and felt ashamed that would curdle later into something like guilt, because I realized with horrible clarity that I'd heard a word I'd written down many times and never once understood, and that maybe, just maybe, it had not been nonsense at all. We searched until the valley refused to be persuaded by light, and then through the night, and at dawn when the frost returned it felt indecent, like the world had closed the book on us. Still, no bodies, no clothing, no footprints heading away on either side. It was as if the twins had used the brief screaming blindness of the train to step sideways out of our reach. And if that idea made the hairs rise on the back of necks, it wasn't because of superstition, but because the alternative, a fall into the water, we could neither find nor prove, fell at once too tragic and too clean. The official line began to form even as we refused it. 2 children, disturbed, isolated, wrong place, wrong time. But in the pub that morning, after we thawed our fingers around tepid cups and decided against breakfast, Megan told me something that made my stomach drop. They weren't walking toward our side, she said, voice splintering in places. They were walking to the middle, and then, while they weren't frightened, see, they looked like they knew something. The Davies boy, emboldened by attention, offered his detail, a hand on the rail, and the railwayman's wife repeated her single-syllable memory with a stubbornness that made me want to be true. I went back to the bridge after the statements and the sterile suggestions of wait and see, and I knelt where the chalk mark had been in search along the inner rail and found, 2 feet further on, another mark, then another, small crescents and loops, shy of becoming letters, like punctuation for A, language no one else could read. I snapped the softest of them with my nail into my notebook, and when I turned the page I found, staring up at me from earlier entries, the scrawl phonetic of that repeated phrase, Cwmmerth, and I felt something tilt in my chest. It would be days before I said aloud, weeks before I chased it properly, but the shape of the thought was there. Not magic, not vanishing, but intention, the twist, if I have to call it that, wasn't that the twins had disappeared. It was that we had been looking for 2 helpless girls who'd fallen through a crack, when in fact 2 determined girls may have slipped through a gap they'd measured themselves. The first confirmation, if such a word can apply to something that still trembles under scrutiny, came that afternoon when a clerk from the bus depot up the line mentioned, almost casually, that the last Saturday's service toward Merthyr Road had stopped before dusk at the lay-by less than a mile beyond the bridge. Nobody asked him anything because nobody knew to not yet, but he volunteered a second detail. A driver had reported 2 small figures waiting near the hedgerow when he made his pass. He hadn't stopped because his route was express at that point, and he hadn't thought about it again until the talk in town set his mind digging back through bland memory. 2 small figures read. It was nothing in the legal sense, no proof, no names, but when I thought of that murmured Cwmmerth, thought of Merthyr, thought of bus routes and that chalk like breadcrumbs most of us didn't know how to read, I felt the storybook in my hands. This was a pivot. We had spent a night staring down at a river that had nothing to tell us, when the twins' gaze may have always been fixed outward, along the rusted lines that stitched valley to valley, toward a word they'd been saying in front of us for months. I tried to tell the constable, but there's an art to sounding both sane and certain at the same time, and I had neither after no sleep and too much self-reproach. Still, something in my insistence lodged. An officer agreed to check the lay-by, another to speak with the drivers, and while they did that, I walked the trackside footpath beneath the bridge, alone, the cold pushing to my coat like a hand. It was quiet there, a second world beneath the one the village moved in, a narrow ribbon of ground packed with old iron filings and the nests of birds that didn't care for our tragedies. I found what? I think I was looking for fixed to the maintenance post that jutted on the bridge. Red yarn, the thickness of something pulled from a hat, tied in a double knot, and then looped around itself the way you'd tie it if you were leaving a sign for someone who would understand. Below that, barely visible unless you were inches away, was a shape in chalk that mimicked the loops I'd copied earlier but now formed a sequence, a path. Perhaps, if you knew how to see paths and symbols, I can already hear the counter-arguments, The mind finds patterns because it wants them, but I measured the height of those marks. Too low for an adult bent to adjust a bolt, exactly right for a child standing on the lip of the maintenance ledge, reaching, and there, pressed into the soot on the metal skin of the post, were twin half-moons of clean where small palms had held. There was no joy in the discovery, only a deepening of the ache, because the difference between an accident and a choice is the difference. Between grief's dullness and its knife. I took what I had at Bronwyn and Gareth, because the police would not yet commit to anything that suggested intention. They had to be careful in all the ways we didn't. And I watched as Bronwyn's face went white with a kind of complicated relief that only a mother can feel. The hope that her girls had not slipped senselessly into the dark, the terror of what it might mean that they had stepped deliberately away. "Merthyr," she said, tasting the word as if it were bitter. "My sister had worked there once in a canteen. Years ago. We visited when the girls were small." She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking in a motion that defied stillness. And then, because mothers bargain with the universe even when the universe isn't listening, she said, "They would not go far without me. They wouldn't." But the rooms of the house had been different for a long time. The twins had been living in a place inside each other, and no one else had a key. In the hours that followed, a slow contest began between two stories, the official probability of a fall and the unofficial possibility of a plan. And in that contest, you could hear the valley argue with itself about what kind of village it wanted to be. Those who sided with the fall spoke with weary compassion. Girls like that, fragile, strange, the noise of the train, a single misstep. Those who sided with the plan were accused of cruelty. To imagine intention was to imagine betrayal. And yet the facts, small and stubborn, arranged themselves. No torn fabric on the rail. No splash heard by any of the witnesses, even in the crescendo of the train. No disturbance along the water where any body might have snagged. Chalk marks that matched the height and reach of children. Yarn that matched the thread of a red hat. A bus route that carried the faint echo of a word I had heard those girls say more times than I could count. In the face of this, the police, sensible, careful, widened the search outward. Station masters were called. Drivers were asked to remember what the brain resists holding on to, and the river team was told to keep looking because the river eats stories and sometimes give them back. For me, the twist wasn't just a shift in theory, it was a shattering of the image I'd built of the twins as enclosed, inert, walled off from the world by fear and strangeness. Instead, I had to consider the possibility that their language, the thing we all thought kept them apart, had been the tool they used to map a route through the world the rest of us couldn't see. I pictured them at the kitchen table with their looped script and their tapping rhythms. Picture them timing the trains by the way the kitchen door trembled and the clock in the hallway ticked. Picture them pressing their palms to that maintenance post and looking at each other with the fierceness of people who are about to do something that cannot be undone. There is nothing supernatural in this. No glamour. Only the terrible competence of children who concluded that the world will not change them, and so they must change the conditions under which they meet it. I walked home that second night passed on, slow, as if the air were thicker, replaying every moment I'd spent around them, wondering which were clues, and which were just the ordinary flotsam of a life. The touch to Eira's left wrist before crossing the street. Was it a signal to check the time? Seren's triple blink, already? The red hats, a way to find each other in crowds, and always, the word Cwmmerth, Merthyr, spooled out across months like a track they'd been laying in plain sight. I stopped at the bridge one last time before sleep and placed my palm where I thought there had been, and I told the iron and the river and the bruise of the sky that I failed in the most ordinary way. I had looked and listened and still not seen. When the third day came with no bodies and a bus driver in the next town over-recalled two small girls sitting very still on the rearmost bench of the late local, facing each other, not speaking, red bright as berries in his mirror. The police could no longer pretend the river was the only listener. The search map changed shape, not just downstream now, but along the road to Merthyr, to Cardiff, to any place that could be reached by the rhythm of wheels and will. And in that widening we felt both the relief of possibility and the terror of distance. The twins had not vanished into myth. They had used the machinery of the world to get away, and the machinery of the world has more places to hide than a river ever will. That night, Bronwyn took the red hat from the peg by the door, the one that had been on either girl's head, and pressed it to her face until it came away wet, and Gareth, who had said very little, picked up a map the police had left and began tracing routes with the blunt tip of a pencil, as if he could move them into existence by pressing hard. I stood before their mantel with its cheap brass clock and the single school photo where the twins' gazes never quite hit the camera, and I felt the story tilt again, preparatory to the long, punishing arc it would take from here. Not a tragedy sealed by a river, but an absence thrown like a net across roads and stations and in different cities. The twist had taken the shape of intention, and intention, terrible, tender, singular, would turn all of us into chasers. The days after Bridge were not days at all, but a kind of stretched, airless, holding pattern in which clocks existed, but no one trusted them, in which the difference between morning and night was only in the direction the shadows leaned. The official search began with a map spread across the trestle table in the back room of the Cwmmerth police station. Pins pushed into towns and laybys, bus stops and sidings. Each one a suggestion of where two small girls might have landed if they had indeed stepped away from us by choice. I was there that first morning, not as any kind of authority, but because my notebook, with its phonetic scrawls and remembered sightings, had become the only collection of details that reached further back than the moment they were last seen, and I found myself handing over pages to a constable who treated them with the same guarded politeness he might have given a witness who was also a nuisance. They began with the bus routes, of course, tracing every service out of the valley that might have coincided with the time the twins vanished. From the bridge, speaking to drivers who furrowed their brows and tried to rewind the reels of their memory. Some remembered nothing. Some thought they might have seen two children keeping to themselves or sat together at the back. But the trouble with witnesses is that after a while they begin to fold the question into the answer, imagining details to fill the holes. Still, a few accounts stuck. A driver on the 545 to Merthyr thought he'd seen two girls in red, hats get off at an unlit stop near the old tin works. A cleaner at the station in Aberdare recalled finding two empty juice cartons and a paper bag stuffed into the corner of a bench the next morning, with what looked like loops of writing on the bag. These were not proof, but in a search like this, proof is a rare and slippery thing. You work with traces, impressions, the faint heat left where someone once sat. The police widened the net to include train stations, asking staff to watch for the twins, but rail travel in those days was a loosened thing. No CCTV, no passenger manifest, no credit card trails, just ticket stubs and the memory of whoever happened to be working counter. Word went out to other towns, other valleys, other counties, and every so often a call would come in from somewhere, Cardiff, Swansea, even as far as Hereford, someone sure they'd seen them in a park, on a street corner, in the queue for the cinema. Each sighting was logged, followed, and inevitably found wanting. Meanwhile, in Cwmmerth, the village became the kind of place where the air seemed permanently tuned to the frequency of waiting. Bronwyn stopped going to the shops, sending Reese instead, her absence in the high street becoming as much a topic as her daughter's disappearance. Garrett took leave from the mine not out of choice, but because. He was useless there now, his mind too busy replaying the sound of Bronwyn's voice calling their names on the bridge. The neighbors, for all their earlier suspicion, rallied in the way small places do when tragedy becomes communal property. Pots of stew left on doorsteps, envelopes with a few notes pushed through the letterbox, offers to sit in the house in case the girls came back on their own. I walked the bridge daily, not because I expected to find anything new, but because I couldn't stop. Myself, scanning the rails for more chalk, the ground for more yarn, the water for anything that might have floated up. There's a particular cruelty in searching when you don't know if you're looking for the lost or for proof of their loss. Every bushy part could hide a clue or nothing at all. Every empty street could be a misconnection. The police organized community searches into the hills and woods, lines of people moving shoulder to shoulder through gorse and bracken, calling the girls' names until the syllables felt strange in our mouths. Sometimes the line would stop, and everyone would gather around some small find, a scrap of fabric, a shoe print, a sweet wrapper, but always it was explained away or proven unrelated, and the disappointment was almost worse than finding nothing, because for that brief moment hope had surged and then been yanked away. Nights were the hardest, phones in the station ringing with tips from people whose voices were thick with drink or desperation, claiming to have overheard children speaking in a funny tongue on a bus or in a shop, none of which led anywhere. I began to travel further afield myself, taking buses along the same routes they might have taken, watching for two small figures in red, listening for that language, More than once I thought I heard it. A quick, liquid burst between two kids on the back seat. But each time, when I turned, it was either English or Welsh twisted by shyness. Nothing like the dense coded weave of the twin speech. Still, those near misses kept me moving because they proved the possibility of encounter, however faint. Bronwyn and Gareth, in their own ways, joined the search too. Bronwyn taking the train to Merthyr and knocking on doors near her sister's old workplace, showing the school photograph to anyone who would look. Gareth driving his battered van along back roads until the petrol money ran out. They came back each time with stories, none of which could be verified. A shop girl certain she'd seen them near the bakery. A woman in a laundrette remembering two silent girls folding clothes that weren't theirs. But each story added a layer to the map we were drawing in our heads, a web of could-have-beens that stretched far beyond the village. The police, for all their methodical persistence, began to hit the wall, diminishing returns. After the first 2 weeks, the officers who had been stationed in the village were rotated out, replaced by others who didn't know the families, didn't know the rhythms of who walked where and when, and the search took on a cooler, more procedural tone. The chalk marks on the bridge were collected as possible evidence, but returned later with a note that they could not be connected conclusively to the missing parties. I kept mine in the notebook, because sometimes evidence is only recognized in hindsight. Spring deepened into summer, and still there was no sign, no trace, and the absence began to settle into the fabric of things, not acceptance, but a kind of enforced carrying on. The children at school grew used to the empty seats. The neighbors grew used to not seeing the twins in the lane, and those of us still searching learned to live in the tension between hope and exhaustion. Yet for all the dead ends, there were moments when the search burned bright again, like the day a farmer outside Brecon reported finding 2 small jackets folded under a hedge on the edge of his field. They were taken away for examination, and though they turned out to belong to his own nieces, for the few hours in between, the village had hummed with the dangerous hum of maybe. There's a saying in small towns that everyone knows everyone's business, but the truth is we only know the business people choose to show us. The twins had shown us so little that finding them meant combing through shadows and guessing which belonged to them. By the time autumn came, the official search was scaled back, but the unofficial one never stopped. Bronwyn still kept the hats on their pegs. Gareth still drove unfamiliar roads with his eyes on pavements instead of traffic, and I still carried the notebook, adding each scrap of overheard language or unconfirmed sighting, as if the accumulation of fragments might one day tip into a whole. People from outside sometimes asked why we didn't just let it go, and the answer was simple. You can only let go of something you've held, and we had never got hold of them. Again, the search was not aligned with an end but a circle, and each lap brought us back to the bridge, to the chalk, to the red wool, to the moment the world decided to show us how easy it could take and not return. It was late November, the kind of night when the wind comes down off the hills in long, low sighs, and the rain doesn't fall so much as smear itself across the windows. When Bronwyn Morgan found the first letter, she told me later that she had been sitting at the kitchen table in, the only light left on in the house, going through a pile of unopened posts that had built up in the weeks since she'd stopped caring about anything that wasn't news of her daughters. And at first she thought it was just another card from one of the women at chapel. Something with dove or a spray of flowers on the front, an envelope hand-addressed but with no return name. She slid it open with a bread knife and slid out a single folded sheet, cream-colored, the kind of paper that comes from a stationery set bought as a gift. What made her stop wasn't the neatness of the fold or quality of the paper. It was the marks on it, not letters, not numbers, but looping shapes and slanted lines that seemed to run in rhythm rather than in rows. Marks she told me she knew in her bones before her eyes had even finished taking them in. It was the writing of her girls, the same looping code they'd filled their school notebooks with, the same private script no one in the family could read. Now, sitting in her hands on a page that had come through the Royal Mail. She said her first reaction wasn't hope but a kind of dizzying disorientation. How could she be holding something that only existed between them when they had not been in her sight for 9 months? But the hope followed, crashing on the heels of confusion until her hands began to shake. She called Gareth in from the living room, and he stood over her shoulder for a long time without saying anything, his eyes moving over the lines as if they might suddenly resolve into something he could read. But they didn't, and in the silence between the rain ticked against the glass. They brought it to me the next morning, still folded, still smelling faintly of the lavender Bronwyn used to keep in her kitchen drawers. and when I opened it, the effect was like stepping into a room I glimpsed only through a keyhole. The shapes, the slants, the little flourishes at the ends of certain loops, all of it exactly as I copied in my notebook from their school papers. I compare it side by side with a page I'd torn from one of their discarded exercise books, and there was no question. It was the same hand, or rather the same two hands, because the girl's writing had always been subtly different. One's lines tighter and more upright, the other's looser and leaning. This letter was a mix, lines alternating between the two styles as if they had passed the page back and forth. The envelope had been posted from Cardiff, the stamp franked just 3 days earlier, and the handwriting of the address was in block capitals that told us nothing. Gareth took it to the police immediately, but they treated it with a caution that bordered on skepticism. They didn't say it outright, but the implication was clear. Anyone who had seen their writing could have imitated it, and without something to prove its origin, it could just as easily be a cruel hoax. Bronwyn refused to believe it was anything but genuine. "I'd know their hands," she kept saying. "I'd know them even in the dark." And I was inclined to agree, not because of sentiment, but because the script was too intricate, too fluid, to have been convincingly forged by anyone who hadn't lived inside it. The police sent it to their lab anyway, testing for fingerprints, for traces of skin cells or fibers, but the page came back clean, wiped, or handled only at the edges. What stayed with me, though, was the way the shapes seemed to hum when you looked at them long enough, as if some part of your brain, the part that handles pattern before meaning, wanted to lean in closer. Over the next 6 weeks, 3 more letters arrived, each one in the same style, each postmarked from a different city: Newport, Swansea, Shrewsbury, none with any clue beyond the writing. The intervals between them were irregular: 10 days, 3 weeks, 5 days, and each time the contents were different, at least in terms of the arrangement of shapes, though none of us could say if the meaning had changed. One letter had a small smudge in one corner, the rusty brown of dried blood, though whether it was human or animal or just some errant stain, no one could say. Another had a faint imprint on the back, as if it had been written on top of another sheet that had been removed. I began to chart the dates and postmarks in my notebook, looking for some logic in the timing, and one evening, spreading all 4 letters on my kitchen table, I noticed something that made my throat go dry. The number of lines in each letter matched, in sequence, the number of letters in the word Merthyr: 6767. It was a tenuous connection, but given what we already knew about the twins' fixation with that word, it felt deliberate. I showed Bronwyn, who saw in it not a puzzle but a message, some proof that they were still thinking of the same places, the same plan. The police dismissed it as coincidence, though one officer quietly told me that in his opinion, the fact that the letters were coming from different towns might mean the girls were moving around, which, while troubling, also meant they were alive. The media got hold of the story in January after someone at the station leaked it to a local reporter, and for a brief, ugly moment the Morgans were back in the headlines. The letters printed in the paper alongside speculation about whether the twins were runaways or victims of an elaborate hoax. Bronwyn hated the coverage, saying it turned her daughters into curiosities instead of children, but it also brought a surge of tips, most of them useless, some malicious, a few worth chasing. One in particular came from a second-hand shop owner in Newport who claimed 2 very quiet girls had come in just before Christmas, one of them buying a battered satchel with coins counted out from a cloth purse. When shown the photograph, the shopkeeper hesitated, then said, "Yes, I think so," though he couldn't be sure. It wasn't proof, but it was a thread, and in the kind of search we were living in, threads were all we had. The letter stopped as abruptly as it had started, the last one arriving in early February, postmarked from Birmingham. The shapes tighter, more crowded on the page, as if whoever wrote them was pressed for time. After that, nothing. No more envelopes in the post. No more looping script sliding through Bronwyn's letterbox, and their absence was, in some ways, worse than their arrival, because it left us with a sense that we had been in conversation, however one-sided, and that conversation had now ended. I still have copies of all 4 letters, and even now, when I look at them, I feel the old unease, the conviction that they were not random, that if someone could break the code, we'd have the map the girls have been following all along. But the code stayed closed, and in its silence the search stumbled back into the same unlit corridors. It had been walking since that night on the bridge, be why the spring of 1979, The official voice of the search for Eira and Seren Morgan had grown quieter, not because the case had been solved, but because the machinery behind it had shifted into a slower, colder gear, the kind that files things neatly and waits for something to happen instead of making it happen. The police still took calls, still logged sightings, still followed up when someone claimed to have seen 2 girls in red at a train, station, or in a market, but the urgency that pulsed through those first weeks after the bridge was gone, replaced by phrases like "no significant developments" and lines of inquiry exhausted, the language of cases that are being moved from the front of the desk to the back. It was around this time that the letters Bronwyn had received, those cream-colored sheets filled with the twins' looping script, were officially reclassified as unverified, a term that meant nothing to her except that the hope she had clung to was now being treated as just another variable in a file. When she asked if the handwriting had been analyzed again, the detective assigned to her case told her, with the kind of polite finality that ends a conversation, that without a key to the code or an independent witness to the girls writing them, there was no way to prove authenticity. To Bronwyn, this sounded like they were asking for proof of something that could only be proven if the girls themselves were found. A paradox that left her sitting at her kitchen table for hours, staring at the folded letters as if they might give up their meaning by will alone. Garrett had by then grown weary of the official channels, convinced that the answers, if there were any, would not come from a desk or a badge, and he spent more time on the road than at home, driving the van along routes that connected the postmarked cities, pulling over at lay-bys to watch the traffic, stopping in cafes and petrol stations to show the twin school photo to whoever would look. He kept a notebook too, though it was filled not with phonetic transcriptions but with names and places, each one linked to a time and a face, a personal map of people who had said, "Maybe I saw them," and people who had said nothing at all. The police called this parallel activity, and while they didn't actively discourage it, they didn't integrate it into their own work either, as though acknowledging it might admit that their own efforts had reached their limit. In the village, the shift in the official stance was felt keenly. Less patrol presence, fewer meetings in the community hall, no more posters being replaced when they faded in the rain. It was as if the case had been absorbed into the background noise of life, the way the old mine shafts or the closed shops were part of the landscape, remarked upon only when someone new asked a question. But for those of us who had been there from the beginning, the absence of news didn't mean the absence of belief. If anything, it made the divide between the official line and the local conviction sharper. In the pub, people still spoke about when the girls come back, not if, and there was a kind of stubborn pride in refusing suggestion that they might be gone for good. Some said they'd made it to a city and were living quietly under another name. Some believed they'd found their way to distant relatives. A few even thought they might have been taken in by a traveling family who understood their language in a way we never could. None of these theories could be proven, but they kept the possibility alive. And in a case like this, possibility is the oxygen you breathe to keep moving. I tried to straddle the two worlds, the procedural caution of the police and the instinctive certainties of the village, but it was like standing with a foot on each side of a widening gap. The more time passed without proof, the more the official version hardened into a set of probabilities. Most likely the girls had left of their own accord, possibly aided by someone, and if they had not resurfaced by now, the chances of doing so were slim. This was not said cruelly, but it landed that way because it made the twins into a set of statistics rather than two living, breathing people we had seen walking hand in hand in the frost. When I pressed one of the detectives about the chalk marks on the bridge, about the red yarn tied to the maintenance post, I was told they had no evidential value without a direct link to the girls. And when I asked about the bus driver's account of seeing them near Merthyr, I was told that without confirmation from the driver at the time, it could not be considered more than anecdote. It was infuriating, not because they were wrong by their own standards, but because their standards didn't seem designed to catch the kind of truth we were chasing. A truth built out of glimpses and overheard words, out of the kind of details that only matter when you already believe. In Cwmmerth, the loss of police momentum was met with an increase in quiet, personal searches, neighbors driving further afield on market days, keeping their eyes open at bus stations, women in the chapel sewing circles who passed around the girls' photograph in towns where they had relatives, teenagers who took trains to Cardiff and Swansea under the pretext of shopping, but came home with stories of watching the crowds for a flash of red or the tilt of A. Familiar head, None of it brought results, but it kept the story alive in a way that official silence could not. I remember one Sunday afternoon in May, standing on the lane near the Morgan's house, watching Bronwyn hang out laundry, and thinking how strange it was that life in the village could look unchanged when in fact it had been split clean through. The official reports might have gone quiet, but in kitchens and back gardens, in the pauses between hymns and the murmurs at the post office, counter, the search was still going, carried in pockets and memory, and the stubborn refusal to let two small girls slip entirely into the dark without someone, somewhere, still looking to be why the summer of 1980. The search for Eira and Seren had ceased to be something Bronwyn Morgan waited for others to lead, and had become a pilgrimage she undertook herself, a long, unspooling journey made not in straight lines, but in a jagged, looping pattern across towns and counties, chasing rumors that were, often no more than overheard words in a shop queue or friend of a friend's memory of two quiet girls. She began with the cities the letters had been postmarked from: Cardiff, Swansea, Shrewsbury, Birmingham, arriving with nothing more than her handbag, the girls' school photograph, and determination that no amount of dismissal could blunt. She would step off the train or out of the bus station and walk directly to the busiest streets, moving from shop to shop, showing the photograph to anyone who would stop long enough to look, always asking the same question: "Have you seen them?" Most said no. Some paused too long before answering. A few offered fragments that sent her walking in new directions. Two girls like that used to come to the library. I think I saw them near the bus depot last month. There were two who matched in the arcade, but that was ages ago. And each time she would note the place and the time in a small spiral-bound notebook whose cover became creased and smudged from constant use. Gareth worried about the toll it was taking on her, the way she would come home with her shoes soaked through, her voice hoarse from speaking to strangers, her face pale and set in a way that looked less like exhaustion and more like refusal, as if she were unwilling to let fatigue claim the space where hope lived. She stopped wearing her good coat because it wore out too quickly on the road, opting instead for a heavy cardigan with deep pockets that could hold her notebook, the photograph, and the envelopes from the letters she still believed were theirs. In some towns, she stayed overnight in cheap lodgings, sitting up late to write out everything she'd been told that day, even when it amounted to little more than impressions. A woman on a park bench glancing twice at her photo, a bus driver frowning as he searched his memory. She began to learn the shape of disappointment in advance, could feel it coming before the person even opened their mouth to say sorry, love, not them. But she kept going, because the stop would be to admit that the trail was cold, and that was something she would not do. I accompanied her once to Newport, and I remember the way she carried herself in those streets, not desperate, not frantic, but with a steady, almost formal persistence, as though she were on an errand whose completion was inevitable, however long it might take. She approached people with politeness that invited them to pause, and when they did, she would hold the photograph at just the right angle so the light caught the twins' faces, as if to fix them in the stranger's mind. Most were kind, some brusque, a few suspicious, but Bronwyn seemed immune to the small rejections, filing each no away and moving on to the next possibility. There were moments on those trips when I caught her looking not at the person she was speaking to, but over their shoulder, scanning the street beyond, as if half expecting the girls to appear at the far end, walking toward her as they had that day on the bridge. She never found them, but she found traces. A second-hand shop owner in Shrewsbury who remembered selling 2 red hats to a pair of quiet girls, a waitress in Cardiff who swore 2 sisters had come in together and ordered tea, speaking in a low, fast voice she couldn't place. None of these could be verified. None led to the next link in a chain, but each was folded into her notebook, underlined, and revisited in her mind until it grew into something more solid than it was. As the months became years, the journeys took more out of her. Her health began to fray at the edges, a cough that lingered, a limb from an ankle she twisted on a cracked pavement in Merthyr. But she pressed on, telling Garrett she could rest when she had her girls back. There was a day in the winter of 1982 when she collapsed in the middle of Queen Street in Cardiff, and when the shop assistant who helped her to chair asked if she was all right, Bronwyn's first words were, "Did you see them? Did you see my girls?" She was taken to hospital and kept overnight, and though the doctor told her she needed to slow down, she was back on the road within a week, notebook in hand. The last time I went with her was to a suburb outside Birmingham, following a tip from a market trader who thought he'd seen them buying fruit. We spent the day walking those streets, stopping at cafes, hairdressers, laundrettes, anywhere someone might have noticed two girls moving quietly through the world. By the end of it, Bronwyn's limp was worse, and her face had the pinched look of someone holding back pain. But she refused to head back until we had walked the perimeter one more time, just in case. When she finally returned home from that trip, she tucked the notebook into the drawer where she kept the letters and didn't take it out again for weeks, as if she were gathering strength for the next journey. Those trips became less frequent as her health declined, but she never stopped entirely, right up until the summer. Before she died, she would still go as far as her body would allow, even if it meant nothing more than taking the bus to the next town and walking its high street with a photograph in her hand. People sometimes said she was chasing ghosts, but that wasn't true. She was chasing the living, and in her mind they were always just around the next corner, waiting for her to catch up. It was the winter of 1987, nearly a decade since the twins had walked to the middle of the bridge and out of the village's sight, when a discovery was made that pulled the whole story back into the light. Not through a letter or a sighting, but through the turning of an old brass key in a door that had not been opened since before they vanished. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, one of those brittle cold days when the light is so thin it makes everything look slightly unreal, and Gareth had asked the sister mayor to help him sort through the upstairs rooms in preparation for some long overdue repairs. The Morgan house, never large, had always felt smaller after the girls disappeared, as if the air itself had thickened, and there was one room in particular, the small bedroom at the back, that Bronwyn had insisted be kept closed, the key hidden away in a dish on top of the wardrobe, just until they come back, she had said, and Gareth, not having the heart to argue, had left it that way year after year. But on that Sunday, with Bronwyn gone 2 years now and the roof beginning to leak above that part of the house, Gareth decided it was time. He climbed the narrow stairs, the wood creaking under his weight, and stood for a long moment before the pale blue door. The paint cracked in places, the old-fashioned keyhole like a blind eye staring back at him. Mare came up behind him, holding the key, and together they turned it, the sound of the lock giving way like a sigh that had been held for too long. The smell hit them first, not rot, not damp, but a faint, dry scent of old paper and something sweeter, like lavender long since faded. The curtains were drawn, but a line of light slipped in where the fabric didn't quite meet, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the cold air. Everything was exactly as it had been the last time the twins had slept there. 2 narrow beds, each neatly made with faded patchwork quilt, a pair of identical woolen cardigans folded at the foot, slippers tucked beneath. On the small desk between the beds was a stack of exercise books, their covers worn soft at the edges, and beside them a biscuit tin, its lid dented slightly. When Gareth lifted the lid, he found it full of folded scraps of paper, each covered in the same looping, coded script the twins had used in their letters, the ink still dark, the lines confident and unhesitating. Some were written on torn pages from school jotters, others on the backs of sweet wrappers or the kind of brown paper used for wrapping parcels, as if the material didn't matter as long as they could get the words down. There must have been hundreds of them, each one a piece of private world they had built between them, a language no one else had ever learned. In the bottom of the tin was something stranger still, a small, hand-drawn map, no bigger than a postcard, inked in the same looping style, with lines that might have been roads or rivers and small symbols scattered across it like punctuation. There were no labels, no compass, nothing to place it in the real world, but in the top corner was the word Cwmmerth, written larger than anything else. Gareth sat heavily on one of the beds, the map in his hand, and for a moment it was as if he were back on the bridge, hearing that word carried across the noise of the train. Mare began leafing through the exercise books and found that every page was filled, front and back, with the same script, sometimes broken into what looked like columns, other times running in long, unbroken lines. In one book, she found a single page where the script was interrupted by a drawing, a crude sketch of 2 figures holding hands, standing in front of a shape that might have been a bridge, the lines radiating from it suggesting either light or noise. The discovery of that room was like opening a vein in the story. Suddenly there was something tangible again, something that might, if understood, explain not just where they'd gone, but why. Gareth took the tin and the books to the police the next day, but the reaction was cautious, the same careful detachment they had always used. Without a translation, they said it was impossible to know whether these writings contained anything useful to the investigation or were simply the imaginative scribblings of two children. Garrett didn't believe they were just scribbles. There was too much repetition, too much structure, too many pages where one section was crossed out and rewritten as if they had been refining something. I was allowed to see a few of the pages, and even without understanding them, I could feel the deliberateness in them. The way certain shapes were always paired, the way the lines sometimes curved around a blank space as if avoiding it. The map was the most tantalizing piece, and for months after it was found, I tried to match its lines to actual geography, tracing bus routes, railway lines, rivers, even footpaths between villages, but nothing fit perfectly. Some of the older villagers speculated that it might be a composite, a map not of one place but of many, stitched together in the twins' private code. Others thought it was entirely imaginary, a diagram of their own world that only made sense to them. Whatever it was, it reignited the case in a small but noticeable way. Reporters returned, old tips were revisited, and for a while there was a sense that the story had moved again. But the momentum didn't last. Without a key to the language, the notebooks and the tin became just another set of unanswered questions, filed alongside the chalk marks on the bridge and the cream-colored letters. Still, for those of us who had been there from the beginning, the locked room was a reminder that the twins had left behind more than an absence. They had left a body of work, a record of themselves in the only language they trusted, and though it remained unreadable, it was proof that their world had been as real and deliberate as our OW. It was the spring of 1992 when word reached me that Di Llewellyn, one of the oldest men in Cwmmerth and a figure who had been a permanent fixture at the far end of the bar in the Black Bull for as long as anyone could remember, was dying, and that he'd been asking to see certain people before the end. Di was a man who spoke little and drank slow, the kind, whose silences were measured and never awkward. So when word came that he had something he needed to get off his chest, the village took notice. I'd known him most of my life. He'd been a young miner when I was a boy, one of the men who could carry whole conversations with just a raised eyebrow, but he'd never involved himself in the story of the Morgan twins, at least not publicly. He'd been among those who searched the riverbank in the first days, but after that he'd returned to his quiet, seated in the pub, never offering speculation, never leaning over a pint to add his own theory. So when I walked into his small, dim bedroom at the back of his terraced house, the air heavy with the smell of coal dust embedded into the walls over decades, I wasn't sure what to expect. He was propped up on pillows, thinner than I'd ever seen him, his hands like paper, his breath slow and deliberate. He motioned for me to sit and waited until the nurse had stepped out before speaking. His voice, when it came, was rasped but clear, and he didn't waste on small talk. I saw them that night, he said. My pulse jumped. I asked if he meant the night on the bridge, and he shook his head slightly. After, he said, after everyone had gone down to the river. He told me that while the search parties were fanning out, he'd walked the track that ran parallel to the railway line, partly to get away from the noise and partly because, as he put it, I've always known where the quiet hides, somewhere between the bridge and the first bend. He saw them, not together, as he might have expected, but one behind the other, moving along the narrow strip of ground beside the track, quick and sure-footed despite the loose stones. He said they didn't see him at first, but when Seren looked back over her shoulder, she didn't startle. She just looked at him for a long moment and then turned away, her lips moving as if she were speaking, though he couldn't hear over the sound of the wind and the rails. Eira never turned, just kept walking, and within seconds they had rounded the bend and vanished from sight. Di admitted that he'd stood there for a moment, frozen, unsure whether to follow or call out, and in the end he did neither. He turned back toward the village and told no one. Not that night, not in the days after, not in the years since. When I asked why, he said, because they looked like they were meant to be where they were, and I didn't want to be the one to pull them back. He paused then, his gaze drifting to the window as though he could see the track from his bed, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower. They were talking, that way they did, but it wasn't just noise. I could hear patterns in it, like when you hear the same verse in him over and over until you start knowing where the rise and fall will be. He said that as Seren looked at him, she spoke a single phrase, 3 quick syllables he couldn't repeat exactly now, but that he'd always thought about later, certain it had been meant for him. I reckon, he said slowly, if I'd followed them, I'd have ended up somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I pressed him on whether he thought they were alone, whether anyone was waiting for them further along the track. But he just shook his head. If there was... I didn't see them, but they weren't afraid, and that's what stayed with me. They weren't afraid at all. His breath caught then, and for a moment I thought he drifted off. But he roused himself enough to say one last thing. They weren't going to Merthyr, not that night. That was just the first name they wanted you all to think of. They had somewhere else in mind, somewhere that doesn't have a name you'd know. It was a kind of sentence that makes you want to demand explanation. But before I could ask, his eyes closed and the nurse returned, giving me a look that told me the conversation was over. He died 2 days later, and I've replayed those words ever since, turning them over like a coin, try to decide if they were the ramblings of a man at the end or the final, unvarnished truth from someone who had kept it to himself for 14 years. If what he saw was real, then the twins had been alive long enough to move beyond the bridge and the village entirely. And if his last words were true, then every map we had drawn, every route we had traced, might have been pointing in the wrong direction from the very start. And the years that followed. Di Llewellyn's last words. The story of Eira and Seren Morgan settled into the valley the way old weather does. More feeling than fact, an atmosphere you carried in your lungs without noticing, until a sudden change in pressure reminded you it was there. By then, most of the faces in Cwmmerth had changed. The coal dust washed from the skin of a generation whose work had been taken from them by closures and politics and time. The post office a cafe now. The chapel converted to flats. The schoolyard resurfaced and lined in bright paint that made the place look kinder than it had ever felt. But if you stood on the lane at dusk, you could still hear the river run under the railway bridge, a sound older than us and indifferent to our searches. And if you watched carefully, you would see the way people paused without realizing as they crossed the midpoint, as though the air itself requested a moment of respect for two girls who had once stood there, hands pressed together and chosen, a direction the rest of us could not follow. I grew older with the story, which is to say I learned where to let silence sit and when to keep asking. And over time, my notebooks became less about evidence and more about memory, a catalog of how the village learned to live with the unclosed shape of that loss. Garrett died the winter the old mine finally filled with water, and at his funeral the vicar spoke of a father's endurance without using the word grief, because grief had long since been too small a word for what the Morgans had carried. And afterward, in the kitchen where the kettle never cooled, I stood in the doorway and watched as neighbors who had once whispered judgments over the twins' strangeness now touched Bronwyn's old biscuit tin as if it were a reliquary, a metal box of maps and loops and marks that proved the girls had been as deliberate as any cartographer charting a new coast. It is tempting, in the tidy economy of endings, to say that the village softened because tragedy teaches compassion. But the truth is Messier. We softened because we were tired, because time wears down even the edges you mean to keep, because those who have been loudest in suspicion learned, slowly and with shame, that difference is not a foreshadowing of harm. The letters, those 4 cream-colored sheets postmarked from different cities, remain untranslatable, not for lack of trying, but because we finally understood they might never have been meant for us, and I keep them alongside the pages I copy from the twins' exercise books. The ink still dark, the lines still perfectly sure of themselves, and sometimes on quiet afternoons when the light slides across my desk the way it used to slide along the rails, I trace the repeated shapes with a blunt finger and listen, not for meaning but for cadence. The rise and fall that Di swore was as structured as a hymn. I believe him now, not because I am romantic or naive, but because the body knows pattern before the mind translates it, and there's a pattern in those loops that refuses to be random. What the twins built between them was not a barricade, but a bridge, a structure sturdy enough to carry 2 small lives across the gulf between the world as it was offered to them and the world they required. If that sounds like poetry, it is only because language is the bluntest instrument we have for describing the work of survival. I have been asked, in interviews and over pints and in the whispery corners of wakes where the talk goes soft, what I think really happened, and I have learned to say what I know and no more. That 2 girls who were treated as a problem to be solved themselves instead. That they studied the timetables not by reading them but by feeling them. The way the kitchen glasses trembled when the freight rolled through, the interval between whistles, the minute the light on the hill changed color before the evening express. That they clocked the bus routes by watching who got on with mud on their boots and who got off with city paper in their bags. That they built a code not to keep out cruelty, though it did that, but to compress time and distance into something two children could carry, that they walked the middle of the bridge on a night when it was loud enough to make their courage private, and that they left marks, chalk crescents, a thread of red, less as clues for us and as confirmation for themselves that they had been there, together, making the same choice, that they were seen, alive and unafraid, moving past a bend, speaking in a rhythm tuned to their own nerve. That weeks later letters appeared in the script of their world, traveling the arteries of ours without ever submitting to translation. That years after that a locked room yielded notebooks and a map no compass could claim, that a dying man's confession added not certainty, but a contour to the possibility that they had known exactly what they were doing all along. You can lay these points on a table like stones and try to build a road between them, and people do. True crime hobbyists with message boards, academics and seminars about constructed languages, the occasional journalist who thinks he can solve what the police could not, but the road never quite lands where they want it. I have stopped envying certainty. What I cling to instead is proportion, the apportioning of weight to what deserves it. The stubborn dignity of a mother who turned grief into geography and went walking inside it until her body said no. The quiet of a father who traced routes with a blunt pencil because moving his hand across a map was the only way left to be near his daughters. The way a village learned to hold both blame and forgiveness in the same palm. And the private splendor, yes, splendor, of two girls who refused a lesser life and made something vast in the narrow space between them. I used to think the story demanded an ending we could point at, a discovery that would seal it with a stamp of truth the way an official report pretends to. But now I think the ending we have is the only one that matches the life it grew from. We are left with choice, the same one the twins made when they were asked by a world of adults to be smaller than they were, accept a frame or draw a new one. Maybe they found an ant in a city who understood stillness and let them keep it. Maybe they joined a household that needed quiet rather than punished it. Maybe they simply kept walking until the walking made them older, and the world learned to stop demanding that their mouths move in ways. That upset them. People want to know if I think they're dead, and I tell them that I think two children who could orchestrate their own vanishing could also orchestrate a life, and that absence is not a synonym for loss. Not always. I can hear the scoff in some throats when I say this, the accusation that I am sentimental, but sentimentality is cheap hope dressed as certainty, and I am not certain. I am simply unwilling to surrender the possibility that two girls whose every action was laced, with intention kept intending, day after day, until intention became adulthood. If you are looking for the moral, I have none to give that will satisfy, because tragedy resists the neatness of morals. But if you're looking for instruction, I can offer this. When a child builds a language, try learning it before you teach them yours. When a child pairs left wrist touches with street crossings and triple blinks with questions, consider that you are being given a lexicon, not a tick. When a child chooses silence, consider that it is not emptiness, but the richest room in their house. If we had known that then, maybe the twins would have trusted us with a corner of their map, and maybe they would have stayed long enough for us to learn how to read it. Or maybe not. Maybe the point of their project was that it required departure, that what they needed could only be built elsewhere, away from the pressure of eyes and the itch of other people's certainty. I have walked the route from the village to the bend more times than I can count. In all weathers, in all kinds of moods, my boots memorized in the camber, the iron smell rising from the rails in heat, the shifted hush of snow, and each time I stopped where Di said he paused and I listened, not for voices, not for a miracle, but for proportion again, the small sound of water doing its work, the low wind catching on the lattice, the echo of a word that is really a direction, Cwmmerth, the syllables bodying for the route that runs, more through will than through place. You might think it's strange that after all this time I still carry one of their pages in my pocket, a photocopy now, the original kept in a box that keeps the light off the ink, and that sometimes, waiting for a kettle or a bus, I take it out and let my eyes move along the loops. It is not treasure hunting. It is a kind of witness, because in a world that wants endings, the act of ongoing attention is a rebellion, and attention is the one gift we can still give the twins that cannot be turned into content or conclusion. If you come to the village now and ask about them, you will get directions to the bridge, because some places are appointments with stories. And if you lean on the rail and let the city clock you carry inside you slow to the valley's pace, you might notice a pair of small chalk crescents so faint they could be accidents, or you might see nothing at all, only metal and water, and the contrail of a bird stitching the sky. Either way, as you walk back across, if you catch yourself turning to the person beside you, lover, friend, stranger, and pressing your palms together for no reason you can name, ask yourself what language you are making in that moment and for whom. The twins taught me that languages are not invented so much as revealed, that they lie coiled in the necessity between people, and that what we call mystery is often just a residue of someone else's right to privacy. I end then not with revelation but with a vow, that I will keep the map without a compass, that I will honor the rooms that stay locked, that I will treat any letter that arrives without translation as a declaration of personhood rather than a puzzle to solve. That when I pass the old ash tree on the schoolyard's edge, now ringed by a bright plastic fence, I will remember two small girls who stood just outside the circle of everyone else's comfort and decided it was safer, kinder, truer to draw their own. And when the wind comes down off the hills in long, low sighs and pushes to the bridge, as if teaching the valley a new vowel, I will hear, not ghosts or fate or the supernatural, but the disciplined miracle of two voices carrying each other forward through a world that asked them to vanish, and the proof that they did not, because I am here, because you are hearing this, because attention is a form of keeping, and I am still keeping them, and perhaps somewhere on a street that does not know their names, they are still keeping each other, moving hand in hand inside a language that held when nothing else would.